Those closest to Rob Reiner were overcome by deep grief and quiet mourning. Just 2 days after the acclaimed filmmaker behind When Harry Met Sally and his wife Michelle were found unresponsive in their Los Angeles home, close friends struggled to process the loss. The house in Brentwood, once filled with laughter and long conversations, now stood as a painful reminder of everything that had been lost. Billy Crystal, along with several longtime friends of the couple, released a shared tribute honoring their memory. But when Billy later spoke privately, his words carried visible weight. He admitted, "He didn't listen to my warning," his voice nearly breaking as he reflected on the passing of Rob, his closest friend for most of his life, and Michelle, who had been a steady presence in that home for decades. The pain he described felt deeply personal and difficult to put into words. Billy Crystal eventually chose to speak more openly. What he shared revealed tensions within the Reiner family that had quietly existed for many years. He spoke of pressure Rob carried without complaint, and fears he rarely allowed himself to express. In this video, we look back at what Billy knew and the concerns he tried to raise. When everything finally came to an end, Billy was left carrying the weight of those unanswered moments. If Rob Reiner was ever part of your cinematic memory, leave a heart in the comments to honor the legacy he left behind. According to Billy Crystal's later recollections, shared privately with a small group of reporters from the Los Angeles Times and Variety, a key meeting took place on Sunday afternoon, November 30th, 2025. Just 14 days before the tragedy, Billy visited Rob's Brentwood home shortly after 4 p.m., following a brief phone call initiated by Rob himself. Rob's voice was calm but direct, with no effort to soften what he was about to say. Only one sentence came through clearly. "I need to talk to you for a bit. It's not about movies." According to Billy Crystal, the moment the door opened, he sensed something was wrong. Rob Reiner stood in front of him looking worn down, missing the usual order and confidence that had always defined him. His shirt was slightly wrinkled, his sleeves rolled higher than normal, and his hair lacked its usual care. When they shook hands, Rob's grip felt noticeably weaker, as if ongoing stress had taken a physical toll. Rob led Billy into the living room but did not turn on the television or play music, routines that almost always marked Billy's visits. Rob poured a glass of water and set it on the table, but he never took a sip. Throughout the conversation, his eyes kept drifting toward the hallway that led deeper into the house. It was a small detail, but Billy later said it stood out immediately. Rob had never seemed that tense, especially not in his own home. After several moments of silence, Rob spoke first. Billy remembered the words clearly because Rob's voice sounded lower and rougher than usual. "Things in my family are a mess right now. I haven't told anyone, but I'm exhausted." When Billy asked him to explain, Rob did not hesitate. He brought up his son, Nick Reiner, and explained that Nick had experienced a serious setback earlier in November that affected his behavior. Rob described sudden irritability, short tempers, and evenings when tensions became so intense that Michelle chose to step away to keep arguments from escalating. Rob also mentioned an incident about a week before Thanksgiving, a heated disagreement in the kitchen over finances and ongoing care. He did not repeat what was said, but he admitted that moment unsettled him deeply and stayed with him long after the argument ended. Rob admitted that, as he spoke, he realized he could no longer predict his son's reactions. He suddenly went quiet for a long stretch of time, lifted his hand to rub his forehead, and stared down at the floor. Billy Crystal later said that image stayed with him clearly. It was not a look of anger, but of deep exhaustion, the kind seen in someone who felt nearly drained of hope, yet still refusing to give up. Rob explained that he was trying to keep Nick close to the family, believing that staying near his parents might help him regain balance. Then he said something that Billy would replay in his mind again and again afterward. "I'm afraid that if I push the boy away, I'll be the last person who makes him fall apart." Rob spoke slowly, almost as if he were thinking out loud. Billy noticed that Rob kept his fingers tightly interlocked, a small but telling sign of someone holding back powerful emotions. It was at that point that Billy responded more firmly than he ever had before. He sat up straight, looked at Rob Reiner for a long moment, and said he understood the kind of father Rob was trying to be. But Billy also spoke plainly. He warned that Rob was placing both himself and Michelle in a risky situation. He stressed that the behaviors Rob had described could not be brushed aside, especially when they were unfolding inside their own home. Trusting family bonds, he said, was natural, but this situation required clearer boundaries instead of continued silence. Rob listened without interrupting. Billy remembered how Rob finally lifted his head, his eyes visibly strained. His voice dropped as he replied that he understood the concern but could not bring himself to view his son as a danger. Rob said Nick had already endured too many painful periods in life, and he feared that even one misstep at the wrong moment could send everything spiraling. As he finished speaking, Rob leaned back in his chair and released a long breath, as if unsure whether his choices were right. The conversation ended in a heavy stillness. Rob stood, walked to the window, and stared out toward the backyard, a place filled with years of quiet family memories. Rob eventually turned back toward Billy, gently placed a hand on his shoulder, and said he would take time to think everything over again. Shortly after Thanksgiving, Billy left the Brentwood house as dusk settled in. He later said that an uneasy feeling followed him for days afterward. According to Billy Crystal, it was one of the very few times he had ever walked away from Rob Reiner's home with a single thought repeating in his mind. Something was deeply wrong, quietly unfolding beneath the surface. It was that private conversation, which Billy would later reflect on after the events became public, that caused many details surrounding what happened in Brentwood to be seen differently. In hindsight, it felt as though the warning signs had always existed, only becoming clear once everything was already exposed. Billy later said that when he first learned what had taken place inside the house, his immediate reaction was disbelief. It did not resemble the Rob he had known for decades. What stood out to him was not the seriousness of the situation itself, but the sequence in which events unfolded. The Brentwood home had never been a place of extended quiet. Rob and Michelle Reiner lived by consistent routines, with people coming and going, scheduled visits, and a steady rhythm to daily life. Yet everything came to attention only when someone arrived as planned, knocked repeatedly, and received no response. That detail unsettled Billy deeply. He questioned how so much time could pass without anyone inside raising concern, and why no one noticed sooner that something was off. He paid close attention to the accounts of how family members first encountered the scene. When Romy entered the house, she saw her father first and quickly ran back outside in distress. Michelle was in another part of the house and was discovered later. Billy said that detail stayed with him because it suggested they were not together at the same moment. In Billy's memory, Rob had once shared that tension in the home rarely surfaced all at once, but instead moved slowly from room to room, unfolding in stages. The image Billy formed of what had happened seemed to follow the same pattern Rob had once described, and that realization unsettled him deeply. One detail Billy could not move past was the length of time that passed before the situation was discovered. He knew there had been a significant delay between when the events occurred and when anyone outside the home became aware. That silence did not align with the man Billy had known for decades. Rob Reiner was someone who reacted quickly, especially when it came to family matters. The idea that the house could remain quiet for so many hours brought Billy back to something Rob had said during their private conversation, that there were moments when the atmosphere inside the home became eerily still. Billy also spoke about the condition of both Rob and Michelle, choosing not to use technical language, but instead framing it through what he had learned from Rob's own descriptions of emotional strain within the family. To Billy, the circumstances suggested a situation shaped by prolonged stress, where feelings that had been held back for a long time finally reached a breaking point. That impression closely matched what Rob had once shared about moments when Nick became overwhelmed, when situations escalated quickly and spiraled beyond control before anyone could intervene. Another detail that troubled Billy was what he later heard about the state of the house itself. According to people familiar with the scene, the furniture and surrounding spaces appeared largely untouched. Having spent countless hours in that home, Billy felt that this detail did not support the idea of an outside presence. Everything inside still reflected Rob and Michelle's routines and habits. To Billy, that familiarity suggested the situation unfolded in a deeply personal and ordinary setting, which made it all the more disturbing. Billy also reflected on Romy's reaction when she entered the house and immediately ran back outside. He said the level of distress described to him suggested something far beyond what any family member could be emotionally prepared to face. He recognized the feeling, comparing it to his own reaction when he first read early accounts of the situation. What troubled Billy most, however, was Nick's absence when everything came to light. He avoided drawing conclusions, but admitted that detail brought him straight back to that afternoon in Brentwood weeks earlier. Rob had told him then that he could no longer anticipate his son's reactions during moments of intense tension. To Billy, Nick not being present felt like a missing piece. When he connected every detail, Billy Crystal came to believe that what happened was not an isolated event, but the final point in a long chain of warning signs that had existed long before anyone recognized them. It was from those unsettling signs that the story began to shift in a different direction, one where Nick Reiner's name no longer appeared in public accounts, only in Rob's private reflections. While many people were still trying to piece together scattered information surrounding the situation in Brentwood, Billy Crystal found himself in a very different frame of mind. He did not begin by asking what had happened, but instead focused on who had left the house before anyone outside understood what was going on. Billy later said that the moment he learned Nick Reiner was not present, a familiar heaviness settled in his chest. It was the same feeling he had carried weeks earlier when he left Rob Reiner's home after their private conversation. Billy never viewed Nick as a distant figure. Nick, whose full name is Nicholas Reiner, was born in 1993 and had long been the source of Rob's deepest concern. Over the years, Rob had spoken openly with Billy about the struggles Nick faced, including repeated setbacks and attempts to regain stability that gradually took a toll on the entire family. Billy clearly remembered Rob sharing that there was a period when Nick nearly disappeared from family life altogether, moving from place to place and cutting off contact for extended stretches of time. Because of that history, learning that Nick was not at the house when the situation came to light immediately brought Billy back to Rob's earlier admission that he could no longer predict his son's reactions once pressure reached a breaking point. Another detail Billy could not overlook was information he later heard about the hours leading up to everything becoming public. Through quiet industry conversations, Billy learned that Rob and Nick had a tense exchange the previous evening during a holiday gathering hosted by Conan O'Brien. Some attendees recalled that Nick appeared unusually unsettled and emotionally unstable that night. Hearing this deeply unsettled Billy, as it mirrored exactly what Rob had once described about moments when his son became increasingly difficult to manage. Billy also paid close attention to reports indicating that Nick had left the Brentwood area before anyone outside the home became aware of the situation. He later learned that Nick was located several miles away that same evening. To Billy, the distance felt significant and aligned with how Rob had previously described his son's behavior during moments of confusion or emotional overload. As developments continued, Billy followed them closely. When images later emerged of Nick appearing in a courtroom setting under supervision, Billy said he was deeply shaken. In that moment, every concern and warning he had ever shared with Rob suddenly felt painfully real. According to information Billy received, Nick remains in custody while legal proceedings continue, with future court dates expected in early 2026. For Billy, the unfolding situation reinforced a belief that what happened in Brentwood was not sudden or unpredictable, but the result of long-standing struggles that had quietly intensified over time. Billy later recalled comments he had heard indirectly from an investigator through acquaintances in Los Angeles legal circles. According to what was shared with him, the case involved many internal family dynamics that still needed careful clarification, particularly the sequence of events during the 24 hours before everything was discovered. Although Billy Crystal was not involved in the investigation in any formal way, those observations reinforced what he already felt. To him, this did not appear to be the result of outside interference, but rather the outcome of pressures that had been building within the Reiner family for a very long time. What caused Billy the deepest heartbreak was the realization that Nick was the very person Rob Reiner had tried hardest to protect. The film Being Charlie was not just another creative project in Billy's eyes. He believed it represented Rob's final attempt to guide his son toward stability. Rob had once hoped the project might serve as a turning point, but over time, the deeper issues remained unresolved. When Billy later saw Nick taken into custody, he felt as though he was witnessing the collapse of hope Rob had carried for years. In private conversations with close friends, Billy admitted that concerns had formed early on. Not because he wanted to assume the worst, but because the warning signs kept stacking up. Rob's confessions, the tense exchange at the holiday gathering, Nick's absence, and his later detention all connected into a pattern Billy could not ignore. As the situation moved from personal concern into formal legal proceedings, Billy understood that the story had entered a new phase. At that point, loyalty and affection were no longer enough to protect the truth that would continue to surface. According to a longtime friend in Beverly Hills, Billy withdrew from his usual routines. He stopped visiting familiar restaurants and skipped year-end gatherings that had been planned in advance. He spent days inside his home, leaving only once to quietly drive through Brentwood before returning without speaking to anyone. Those around him sensed he was retreating into private grief. For Billy, losing Rob was not like losing an ordinary friend. It felt like losing a part of his inner world, someone he had relied on for decades. Rob had been the first person Billy called with good news, and the one he turned to when he felt uncertain. What hurt most was not only the loss itself, but that it happened when Billy was not there beside him. Friends said Billy replayed their final conversation repeatedly, remembering Rob's tired eyes and the concern in his voice when speaking about his son. Billy admitted he sensed something was wrong, yet still believed Rob could manage on his own. That belief became the heaviest burden he carried afterward, leaving him questioning whether he should have stayed longer, spoken more firmly, or pushed harder to confront the danger he now felt had been close all along. A quiet rumor circulated that Billy Crystal had gone back through his call history, rereading old messages exchanged with Rob Reiner. The short notes and casual jokes they once shared had become almost too painful to look at. One friend later recalled Billy saying privately, "I thought I still had plenty of time. I was wrong." He repeated that line more than once, not as a complaint, but as a confession. Alongside the sorrow grew a quiet anger directed entirely at himself. Billy did not blame Rob, nor did he place responsibility on anyone else. Instead, he criticized himself for choosing to be the kind of friend who listened carefully, but did not push firmly enough when it mattered most. He blamed himself for believing that Rob's love for his son would be enough to keep everything steady. That anger did not surface all at once. It lingered slowly, keeping Billy awake night after night. Friends said he often woke before dawn, walked through the house in silence, then sat for long stretches staring out the window without turning on a light. The weight of that realization grew heavier as Billy accepted that his fears had unfolded in the most painful way possible. It left him feeling both like a witness and an outsider. In the few conversations he had with close friends, Billy admitted that this sense of helplessness felt even harder to carry than loss itself. He had noticed the signs, spoken up, and warned, yet none of it was enough to change the outcome. People within the entertainment industry quietly shared that Billy declined television appearances longer than expected, despite strong interest from major programs. According to someone close to him, Billy said he was not ready to speak Rob's name publicly without losing his composure. Each mention brought back memories and a renewed sense of guilt for not being there when things slowly slipped beyond control. During this period, Billy began reflecting on nearly 50 years of friendship with Rob, not to search for explanations, but to protect the memories that existed before everything else reshaped them. Eventually, Billy chose to speak through a joint statement signed alongside his wife Janice Crystal, Rob's closest friends, and longtime collaborators, including Albert Brooks, Martin Short, and Larry David. The focus was not on events, but on honoring a bond that had endured for nearly a lifetime. The statement also carried the names of many figures deeply connected to Hollywood's history, including Mark Shaman, Barry Levinson, and others who had worked alongside Rob for decades. It was sent to the Associated Press as a dignified and deeply emotional farewell to Rob Reiner and Michelle Singer Reiner. For Billy Crystal, being part of that statement carried special meaning. It was not only a public tribute, but a way to give voice to a friendship that had lasted nearly half a century. In the statement, friends of Billy and Rob reflected on what had connected them from the very beginning. It was a shared love for cinema and storytelling, for darkened theaters where strangers could laugh together, reflect together, and sit quietly moved by the same story. That was the world Rob lived in fully, and Billy had witnessed it from the earliest days. Their friendship began in the mid-1970s on the set of All in the Family. At that time, Rob was already a recognized television figure, while Billy was still finding his footing. Despite that difference, they quickly recognized a shared way of seeing life, shaped by humor, thoughtfulness, and sincerity, rather than fame. What began as conversations after filming soon grew into a lasting bond. They became close friends, then creative partners, and eventually steady presences during the most important chapters of each other's careers. That relationship deepened further when Rob moved into directing. Billy was not only an actor in Rob's films, but someone Rob trusted to exchange ideas with, shape dialogue, and refine emotional moments. When Harry Met Sally became the clearest example of that trust. The film was not only a cultural milestone, but a reflection of the creative understanding between the two men. Billy later said Rob was one of the few directors who allowed him complete freedom while still offering clear guidance. In the statement sent to the Associated Press, friends described Rob as a master storyteller who moved easily between comedy, drama, and documentary styles. Those words were not simply professional praise. They came from people who knew how deeply Rob respected actors, valued writers, and created environments built on collaboration rather than command. For Billy, the hardest part of writing those words was speaking of Rob in the past tense. Rob was not only a collaborator, but someone woven into his personal life. Billy was a familiar presence in Rob and Michelle's Brentwood home, sharing long dinners and conversations about family, society, and the responsibility artists carry. Knowing that Rob and Michelle passed away together in that same home left Billy feeling as though some of his most private memories had been shattered. The joint statement also honored Rob and Michelle as a couple, remembering their partnership as one defined by loyalty, resilience, and shared purpose. Billy Crystal had long admired the way Michelle Singer Reiner stood beside Rob Reiner, not only in family life, but also in social and civic causes that mattered deeply to them both. That admiration only deepened the sense of loss, because Billy felt he had lost two people who were inseparably tied to one of the most important chapters of his life. In the closing portion of the joint statement, Billy and his friends included a line from It's a Wonderful Life, a film Rob deeply loved. The quote reflected the idea that one person can touch countless lives, and when they are gone, the absence they leave behind is immeasurable. Billy understood that meaning in a personal way. For him, the space Rob left was not only in cinema history, but in daily life, in phone calls that would never be returned, and conversations that would remain unfinished. After nearly 50 years of friendship, Billy speaking publicly was not simply a response to loss. It was an intentional act by someone determined to preserve the truth of who Rob was beyond headlines or speculation. He wanted Rob to be remembered not just for his films, but for his loyalty, curiosity, and generosity toward those around him. The passing of Rob Reiner and Michelle Singer. Reiner was not only a shock within the entertainment world, it marked the quiet and irreversible end of a bond that had lasted almost half a century. Beneath the laughter on screen and the legacy of classic films remained a sense of regret, unanswered questions, and a sorrow that time may never fully soften. When Billy chose to speak, it was not only an expression of grief, but a reminder that warning signs often appear long before outcomes are understood. Sometimes even recognition is not enough to change the direction events take. We invite you to share your thoughts respectfully in the comments. If you would like to follow future stories, consider subscribing to the channel and turning on notifications for upcoming videos.